we are, whoops, sorry. Let me start over again. Thank you all for coming today. Really appreciate you being here. First, I would like to acknowledge that we are based in and doing work in communities situated on the unceded territory of the Wabanaki Confederacy. Again, thanks for joining us. This is an online learning series hosted by the Community Resilience Partnership Regional Coordinators and Community Partners. The series is entitled Building Stronger Communities and is designed for communities already enrolled in the Community Resilience Partnership, or also known as the CRP, those currently enrolling or those considering enrolling. So today we'll be talking about how service providers, A Climate to Thrive, and Southern Maine Planning and Development each brought together neighboring communities to write climate action plans. And we're also going to hear from Kennebec Valley Council of Governments on how 3 towns in central Maine are converging around a land conservation project and flood resilience for consideration in the CRP. But first, let me introduce myself and my fellow presenters. So I'm Yvette Meunier, the Regional Coordinator for Region 3 in the Community Resilience Partnership. And I work with service providers and communities enrolled in Kennebec, Franklin, Oxford, Somerset, and Kennebec County. I'm also joined today by Robin Stanicki. She's the Community Resilience Coordinator with Kennebec Valley Council of Governments. She serves as a regional coordinator for Waldo County and also as a service provider for Kennebec, Somerset, and Waldo counties in the program. We also have Rena Grader, the Sustainability Coordinator with Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission. She works collaboratively with local governments to develop regional sustainability efforts and support local climate action. And prior to joining SMPDC, Karina served as a Sustainability Coordinator for the University of Maine. She has studied physics and earth science at Bowdoin College and obtained her master's in earth science at Dartmouth. And then lastly, we have Johanna Blackman, who is a founding member and the executive director of A Climate to Thrive on Mount Desert Island. Johanna brings together over a decade of experience in nonprofit management and over 12 years of experience in climate action and a background in education, youth mentorship, counseling, psychology. And her interests lie in supporting anyone in finding their impactful contribution to climate solutions that build better, thriving communities. So thank you all. Just a reminder that today we are recording our session for later viewing. And just a little more on Zoom etiquette. I know we've all been on lots of calls, but if you could please stay muted unless you're speaking. Keep the video off unless you have something distracting, or keep it on unless you have something distracting going on. Rename yourself in the participants tab if your name doesn't reflect your name or town or organization. And lastly, we're going to hold questions until the end of the presentation, but you can feel free to type them in the chat at any point, and we'll call upon you if you have your hands raised as well. So just a quick overview of today's agenda. We're going to have a very brief overview of the Community Resilience Partnership. You can certainly reach out if you'd like some more information. We'll have some links in our chat because many of you are already enrolled, but we're going to jump into a case study with A Climate to Thrive on how they worked with Bar Harbor, MDI, and Tremont to develop that climate action plan, followed by a case study from Southern Maine Planning and Development on how they're working with Biddeford, Kennebunkport, and Kittery to address climate action planning. And then finally, the case study on how 3 central Maine towns are converging around a land use conservation project with Q&A at the end. So I just wanted to start by sharing a little bit more about the Community Resilience Partnership for those of you who are unfamiliar. It's a Community Resilience Partnership is a new grant program from the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future, or GOPIF. The program is aligned with the Maine Won't Wait 4-year climate action plan, and it helps Maine communities reduce emissions and prepare for the impacts of climate change. The CRP aims to secure grants to directly assist municipalities and tribal governments undertake climate and resiliency projects. And to learn more, there's a link in the chat to this program. So enrolling in the CRP is the first step to accessing this assistance. And it's going to require that a town pledge their commitment to addressing climate change and resiliency. And it also includes taking a resiliency baseline self-assessment, and as well as engaging the public in decision-making. So once you have enrolled, you can apply for grants with the technical support of the CRP program. And this may start in the form of assistance from a service provider you may have chosen to work with to complete the enrollment process. And they will also help you with your first program-sponsored community action grant. However, if you enroll on your own, one of your first contacts might be with your regional coordinator. And regional coordinators are going to be there to help you assist with grants beyond the first service provider assistance, and then throughout the enrollment in the program, which is 2 years when you are going to be reevaluated to continue. Regional coordinators are also looking to collaborate and find projects they can coordinate amongst enrolled communities. And there are 4 regions that the state's broken out into. And so we're mostly focused in our own region. So I'm region 3. And of course, regional coordinators are also going to help bring additional program development and technical assistance to projects. So a little bit more about the grant assistance. The program supports biennial no-match community action grants, which can range from $50,000 to $125,000 for enrolled communities, and it depends if they are individual or collaborative projects. Regional coordinators are going to help you seek other state, federal, and private grants that are going to align with 72 projects that the program sponsors, and I'll get more into what those 72 actions are in a second. And they cover anything from transportation, building modernization, emission reduction, natural resource protection, infrastructure, planning, and a lot more. So today we're going to share with you how some communities are using the CRP to advance collaborative projects amongst multiple municipal boundaries. And first up, we've got Johanna Blackman joining us from A Climate to Thrive. So thank you, Johanna.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for being here today. It's a really exciting program, and I know that we have greatly enjoyed and benefited from participating in this. So as I said, I'm Johanna Blackman, and I am the executive director and a founding member of A Climate to Thrive here on Mount Desert Island. And ACT has been in existence since 2015. And so it was doing a lot of work before the CRP came along, and we've really noticed the difference in how the existence of the CRP has impacted the work, not only for ourselves, but we also support and consult with many organizations through our community groups and organizations throughout the state, and seeing how this program has helped deepen and amplify their work has been really great as well. So we can go ahead to the next slide, please. So in thinking about what I wanted to highlight from our case study here on MDI, I wanted to really bring forward this concept of community-driven climate action. And I think that there's some really great ways in which the CRP is designed to hopefully really pull forward this approach to addressing climate preparedness in communities and mitigating emissions and things like that. So this is really speaks to me and to A Climate to Thrive, because this was how we got started. And we've talked more and more in recent years about this term community-driven climate action at A Climate to Thrive in our work supporting communities throughout the state. And we define it as climate action that is both developed and implemented with a high degree of community participation and ideally leadership. And this is really important and helpful for many different reasons. So we can go ahead to the next slide, please. So this approach to climate action brings a lot of benefits to a community, and we've had the fortune here of experiencing those benefits directly because A Climate to Thrive was started by a group of residents putting out a call as broadly as they could through the community, inviting people to come together over potluck dinners and talk about what we could do in our 4 towns here on MDI to address climate change and prepare for climate impacts. And so from the beginning, it was really this like ground up community driven approach. And we have come back to that over the years as we've formalized as a nonprofit, as we've hired full-time staff and really moved in the direction of being a solidified organization. We've tried to continue to come back to how can we really make sure that we're tapping into the community and also empowering the community, because what we've seen is that when plans are developed and implemented with that high degree of participation, they, of course, are more likely to reflect local priorities. And this feels like a given, but I think so often, we forget because there isn't necessarily always local capacity for this type of work. And it's really welcome when something from the state level or federal level can really help us along. But those levels of operations aren't as in touch with what's happening locally. And so we've really seen how this approach really helps make sure that local priorities stay at the forefront of whatever is happening. And the CRP is designed so that in the enrollment process, as they talked about, you need to do a lot of check-in with your community. And that is really helpful in ensuring that you're applying for the grants that match your community's priorities. It also increases the likelihood, this approach increases the likelihood that the actions will address intersecting challenges and opportunities. And so that's something that we found with the towns here when looking at the different fundable actions on the program's list. There's an opportunity to really think about, well, is housing an issue here locally? And how can we identify action items here that help us address that intersecting challenge, which of course, connects with climate impacts? Do we have a really vibrant working waterfront community? And is there concern there about what's going to happen? And how can we bring that intersecting issue to the forefront of what we're getting these grants for? So the more people locally who are at the table helping to provide feedback on what you're applying for funding for, the more likelihood you're going to have to be able to identify those challenges that you can address at the same time. This third one here, the building of capacity, has been one that has been so important here on MDI and in the communities that we support throughout the state, is something that I'm hearing over and over again, which of course is that our small local governments are already over capacity, right? So it's not even that they're at capacity, they're already trying to do too much. And so this program is so welcome, but to think about going through the enrollment process, applying for the grants, and then implementing the grants is really kind of mind-blowing. And thankfully there's service providers and regional coordinators to help, but to have more of a day-to-day support on the ground when we can really build empowerment and community participation, that capacity can increase in a really meaningful way. And what we've also found here on MDI is that taking this approach of involving the community really highly increases the likelihood that we're going to really focus on how can these actions that we're taking to build resilience in the face of climate impacts and to mitigate climate change simultaneously cultivate local empowerment and equity. And what we found is that when our local community owns solutions like solar generation, for example, that there's equity that comes back to the community, and it's pretty significant actually from that ownership. And so that has been really important for this community, in this community-driven approach as well. And we can go on to the next slide, please. So we wanted to take a moment to look at the MDI timeline in relationship to us as a case study. So ACT, as I mentioned, was founded in 2015. And so there were these early years where a lot of projects were happening. And we had this formal launch in early 2016 where over 200 community members came, and we broke into focus areas, focusing on things like transportation, renewable energy, building efficiency, policy, food systems. And basically in these breakout groups, local residents came up with an initial list of first projects. And this feels really similar to what the enrollment meeting, the community enrollment meeting could look like in the Community Resilience Partnership. You're going to have a list of actions that are already there for you to look at, which is really helpful. But you get to hear what your community's priority is in those actions. And having that launch event meant that our community really understood and came forward and considered how they could be leaders within those initial lists of actions that ACT took here locally. And so there were early municipal actions as well, including the Tremont Solar Array, which some folks might have heard about, the town of Tremont here in MDI, which is our smallest town. developed a municipally owned solar array that was the first town to be completely powered by their own solar in what was then a Myriad territory. And so towns were involved from the beginning. And we really saw ourselves as, how can we add capacity to, we knew the towns were interested in this type of climate action and planning, but how can we add capacity? And then a really wonderful thing happened around 2019 into 2020, which was that a group of students from both the College of the Atlantic and the local high school brought these declarations of climate emergency to the different towns on the island. And 3 of the 4 towns passed a declaration. And in that declaration, it required that the towns begin climate action planning and implementing a plan. And I've heard this from a lot of different communities that act as supported in the state, that either some sort of town declaration or commitment is very helpful. And it could be joining the Global Covenant of Mayors. It could be a declaration of climate emergency, but it really inspires the community to make a commitment up front, and that's very helpful. And so climate action planning then began, and ACT has supported the towns to varying degrees, from supporting a community group that is developing the plan to being contracted with the town to write a climate action plan ourselves in the past few years. And then, of course, the CRP was announced in 2021, and it was just fantastic news that our towns were going to be able to receive funding for something that they already really wanted to be doing. And so we immediately contacted the 3 towns who had these declarations of climate emergency and were developing climate action plans, and said, hey, this is such an incredible opportunity. Can we support you in getting enrolled and in submitting a joint grant together, or submitting a grant together? At that point, we said, let's just talk and think about if a joint grant or individual grants make sense. And so we can go on to the next slide, please. So back in early 2022, after putting that news out to the towns about the CRP and educating ourselves on the program, we brought together sustainability committees and or climate action task forces that had been developed by each of those 3 towns. And we reached out to the 4th town. They weren't quite ready yet. They were just kind of developing some internal capacity to join, and they are now enrolling. Southwest Harbor is starting the enrollment process, which is really exciting. But we brought together these community-based, volunteer-driven groups that were charged with climate action in Mount Desert, Bar Harbor, and Tremont. And it was really great because, again, it's going back to that community-driven approach that can really help increase that capacity. And the 3 towns, representatives from those 3 towns groups came together, learned about the program, and then started to talk about, well, how are we going to do our enrollment process? Do we want to hold meetings together or individually? And then do we want to write individual grants initially or a collaborative grant? And they decided to write a collaborative grant for that first round, which was very exciting because, as you can see from this map, and as folks might know, we're all together on this island. And so thinking about this cohesively has really strong benefits to how we can maximize dollars and maximize efforts. And so ACT supported the towns in starting the enrollment process, understanding the resolution that needed to be passed, walking select board members through the process, and then hosting both the self-assessments and also the vulnerability assessments, and then also the community meetings. And at that time, it was there was more comfort in having those virtually via Zoom. So we had to develop a tool for all those in attendance to be able to vote online on which actions were their top actions, and kind of grouped them in a way that was approachable by the community. And it was a great process. And one of the things that really stands out to me from that process is the vulnerability self-assessment. I've seen the towns on the island, and all 4 of them have done this process now, approach it differently. And when as many people as possible can come to the table, as opposed to just a couple town officials, to do that self-assessment, so the whole select board or the whole town council being part of it. It's really a neat opportunity to consider what you're already doing through a climate-focused lens, that maybe you haven't applied that lens to, emergency simulations that you've done, but to think about steps you've already taken that can now be applied to being prepared for climate impacts is a really great process for a town to do. And I've emphasized over and over with the towns that we've worked with that answering really honestly is the important part, and that the program does not penalize those who haven't taken these actions. A lot of us haven't, but it's such a great way to pause and think about what have we done and what could we be doing. We were successful. And then ACT wrote the first grant, and we'll talk a little bit about what we got the funding for in a second, but we were successful and it's been great. I will say that there's some challenges, one in particular being that with the joint grant process, you have to identify one town to kind of manage the grant. And that makes sense for many reasons, but it also can lead to a lot of work for one specific town, and also can lead to the towns maybe not all feeling entirely equitable in how the process unfolds. And so that's just a thing to talk about up front and kind of address and figure out who's going to do that and how that communication is going to flow really seamlessly. We can go to the next slide. So that was the joint grant process, and I'll very briefly in a moment list what we applied for funding for with those 3 towns. And then when we came to the fall round, Southwest Harbor had not yet enrolled, and the other 3 towns that had originally done the joint grant process for the spring cycle decided to apply individually in the fall. And Bar Harbor by that point had hired a sustainability coordinator, and they handled Bar Harbor's process for the fall grant, and we supported Mount Desert and Tremont. And once again, it was a very community-driven decision-making process where it was the sustainability committees, a group of folks deciding what they wanted to apply for, and really focused on trying to combine intersecting actions. And I want to talk about that a little bit more in a moment, how to maximize the dollars to do a bunch of different things at once and build on that first grant. And we were successful in the second round of grants as well, which was really great. And this graph here kind of shows how the actions that we've gotten funding for cover different components of a climate action plan process, whether it's the development of a climate action plan, implementation, or building capacity for a climate action plan. We can go to the next slide, please. Great. So the first grant, the March 2022 joint grant, ended up funding EV chargers for the 3 different towns with a focus on trying to site them in a manner where they could be available to renters and really focusing on the year-round community. And then community engagement events. And this reflects that recognition that if we can empower the community, learn from the community, and provide opportunities for education and developing leaders in the community, then we're going to increase our capacity for the future grants that we might be applying for in future action. And so community engagement events focused on a variety of different topics were also part of that first grant cycle. And we can go to the next slide. And then the fall grants, Mount Desert focused on a combination of different pieces that would either help inform their climate action plan or start early implementation. So pre-development for a municipally owned solar array, greenhouse gas inventory, and vulnerability assessment to help both inform their climate action plan, but also talk to the community about why they're doing what they're doing and what vulnerabilities the community has. And I've heard from folks throughout the state that vulnerability assessment is super helpful to be able to talk to people about why this type of work is important. And then the Gulf of Maine Research Institute has a program called a community resilience training, and communities can access that program at the moment free of charge, but there's a lot of work that the local community needs to do to kind of bring it to their town. And so there's some funding for that work as well. We can go to the next slide. Tremont also did a combination. We supported Tremont in a combination of different activities that intersect. And so they are at the beginning of their planning process for what they're calling a community resilience plan. And they are also, so that they got funding for that process, as well as for greenhouse gas inventory, vulnerability assessment, and that training to all kind of inform that planning process. And we can go to the next slide. And then Bar Harbor's fall cycle of the grant was focused on a really important item in early climate action plan implementation, which was energy efficiency upgrades for the town building, which is a very large, very old building. And this was a really key first action item that the town had identified as being very important. And they got funding support to do that action. We can go to the next slide. So before I wrap up in just a moment, wanted to bring forward again that capacity challenge, because I know that, for our towns here and for many I've talked to in the state, this is a really exciting program, but having the capacity to do all these steps, and particularly in implementation, feels really overwhelming for small towns. And so just want to call out again the importance of the service providers, the regional coordinators, but also community action groups, other folks and other groups in your town that are working on things that intersect with climate. That can be a really important and powerful way to increase capacity. And I think it's sometimes overlooked, but has a lot of potential. And that's what we've experienced firsthand here. And then finally, considering funding a position, and I know that there are several towns in the state that have used the grants to fund a position to implement the actions. And of course, it has to be focused. The position has to be entirely focused on implementing those actions that you applied to fund, but that can be a way to also increase capacity. And next slide, please. So just wrapping up with the key lessons that I think we've learned from our case study here, and that's that value of the community-driven approach that I talked about back at the beginning. And so not only in starting the discussions about local climate action and joining the CRP, but continuously throughout, building that local leadership and using that local leadership so that it's not just, the few folks that are working in the town office taking this on as well. Collaborating between towns, which also can build capacity, checking in and supporting each other, even if it's not in a joint grant. Partnerships with other organizations can be really helpful, because climate touches so many different aspects of our community's daily life. And so many folks who are working on things in your town will have intersections with this. And then long-term community engagement and leadership. And then coming back to that point of local ownership matters. And I think that as a community thinks about joining the CRP, a really important thing to talk about is, do we want to have, kind of control and decision-making power about how we navigate preparing for climate impacts and how we navigate solutions to climate change, and being able to own those solutions whenever possible and bring that equity back to our community. And so that's a really powerful point to rally around as a community. And then final slide. And so just wanted to put a plug in for communities that are considering this or considering climate action. Climate to Thrive hosts a call monthly called Local Leads the Way, and we have communities joining us from all over the state at varying points, some just considering getting started, some more started, and we share resources with each other, and it's very helpful for all of us, and anybody is welcome to join. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Johanna. And thank you everybody who's been chiming in the chat. We've got a couple of great questions that we'll bring up at the end, so please keep them coming. And next up, I'd like to invite Karina.
Great. Thanks, Yvette, and thanks, Johanna, for sharing that great presentation. Hi, everyone. My name is Karina Grader. I am the Sustainability Coordinator with Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission. You may be familiar with us. We are the regional planning organization in Southern Maine, serving York County and 9 communities in Southern Oxford County. And I'm excited to share a case study here with you all today of our joint community action grant project. We call it the Southern Maine Climate Action Planning Cohort, or CAP cohort. So I'll go in a bit about what that project is about and what we're doing with it. And then also a little bit into how the project was developed and, what are some things to consider when putting together a multi-municipal project. Next slide. Okay, so the Southern Maine Climate Action Planning Cohort is a project to help 4 communities in Southern Maine put together climate action plans. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what a climate action plan is and why communities might want to do one with their community action grant funding. So a climate action plan is a strategic plan that communities can adopt. It is basically a roadmap for steps that the community can take to address both the emissions that cause climate change and also to help the community adapt to the impacts of climate change. And those are actions that can happen from a municipal perspective, so municipally led actions, but the plan can also include actions that are led by community members or from local organizations. So the types of things that are addressed in the plan to help reduce emissions are things like making transportation low carbon, promoting renewable energy, getting off fossil fuel heating and more sustainable heating sources. For adaptation, it's things like protecting from floods, either from coastal storms or from inland extreme precipitation events, using nature-based solutions to work with the ecosystems and adapt to climate change rather than against. Upgrading infrastructure for our new normal of climate conditions. And also things like hazard mitigation and land use planning, which are things municipalities are doing all the time. And then sort of in the middle, there are all sorts of actions that can help both reduce emissions and help with adaptation related to increasing education about climate change, water conservation, thinking about complete and sustainable communities, as well as local food systems. So it's a really holistic, but also direct way of identifying strategies to address climate change in your community. Next slide. So our name also includes the word cohort, which is a bit wonky, but we used it because it really describes what we're doing with this project. So the Climate Action Planning Cohort is a group of communities that all have the shared interest of wanting to get climate action plans in place and set goals for of reducing emissions and adapting to climate change. And the communities have committed to going through this process together. So working together to share resources, share experiences, and learn from one another so that the results of this planning process can be greater than just the plans in their individual communities. So we're calling it a cohort, but really we're a team or a group of communities working together. Okay, so that's sort of the background of what the type of this project is. So who is in our climate action planning cohort? The communities we're working with are 4 communities in southern Maine, Kennebec, the city of Biddeford, Kittery, and Kennebunkport. And 3 of these communities had been working with SMPDC previously on climate change related work. And then Biddeford has been working on climate change for a long time in their own community. And so something that all these towns had in common was that they were sort of at a similar stage of thinking about addressing climate change in their community. They had all done greenhouse gas inventories already. They had already all started looking especially at the sea level rise impacts of climate change. And they were really ready to take the next step of, we kind of understand where we're at. We have some ideas about what we want to do, but we really need a plan in place in order to build community support for climate action and identify what's most important to our communities. So those are all the 4 communities that are participating. And then what are we doing? So over the course of about a year and a half, SMPDC is leading these 4 communities through a planning process. The planning process is standardized to some extent throughout the 4 communities in that we're sharing sort of planning resources, and we're taking opportunities throughout the process to learn from one another as a group. And then we're also taking time to think about our challenges and our goals from a regional perspective. So are there some things like transportation emissions challenges or affordable housing that could be addressed regionally rather than each community working on their own in a bubble. So this is an opportunity to work on those things, not only in these 4 communities, but also for SMPDC as a regional organization to think about how those strategies could be applied throughout the broader Southern Maine region. So at the end of this process, each community is going to have their own local climate action plan. We're not making a joint plan. We want each community to have their own roadmap and really have ownership and the ability to take the next steps. So each one will have their own climate action plan, but that plan will be informed by one another and reflective of one another. And then at the same time, we're taking the opportunity to create our own climate action planning toolkit that can go beyond just the climate action plans in these communities. So putting together resources, some standard planning process, checklists, public engagement planning resources, template materials that can all go into SMPDC's climate action planning toolkit that we can then use in the future with more communities in our region, but also will be available just broadly to all communities and municipalities throughout Maine for them to take a look at and learn from and use if they see them as helpful in their own climate action planning journeys. So that's sort of an overview of the project. We got, as I mentioned, this is a project supported by a community action grant. So I thought I'd just take a few minutes to talk about how this project came from, just an idea to now we're in the middle of it right today. And so I put together this project development timeline. So what happened was, I think climate action planning, in the past few years has been sort of a burgeoning topic for municipalities to consider. South Portland and Portland were putting together their One Climate Future plan. And so we had just heard from a handful of different communities who we were talking to. They were just saying, is a climate action plan something we could do? How much would that cost? Who would we hire to do it? Is it useful for a community like us? And, we took 4 or 5 of those calls or people expressing those thoughts on group meetings. And our sustainability and resilience team was like, you know what? Like, we should be able to find a way to help all of these communities do a climate action plan at the same time. It doesn't make sense for everyone to be putting out their own requests for proposals and sorting through consultants and trying to figure out a budget. Like, there must be a way we can make this easier and get more communities on board. So that was about summer of 2021. And then over the next few months, we sort of developed a pitch and a proposal about what a climate action planning cohort could look like. And we arranged a meeting with about 10 of our Southern Maine communities. So we put out an email blast to a lot of different communities, I think all the communities in our region, and asked if anyone wanted to come to this meeting to learn more. And we hosted it, and about 10 communities showed up, and we sort of explained what climate action planning was and why it could be important, and heard what communities' needs were for a planning process. And at the end of it, we just asked if anyone was interested in moving forward with actually scoping out a project and committing to doing a plan. And after that, we had the 4 communities you see here basically all signed on board and said, you know what, yep, this is something we want to do now. We have select board or town council support, like, let's scope out a project and start applying for funding. So we did that in winter of 2022. We applied for a community action grant, and we also identified some other sources of grant funding that could be used for the project. We put together a budget and a scope of work. And then we were lucky enough to receive our community action grant. And that was sort of the moment where we were like, okay, this is happening. Like, let's get started. So there was a bunch of onboarding activities. The municipal staff had to check in with their governing bodies to make sure, this could go forward. They had to include their costs in their budgeting processes. and we had to start putting out proposals for consultants. So that all took a long time to sort of get ramped up, you know, from over a whole year was basically the time it took to get this project from idea to actually getting started. But we got there. A lot of good people put in a lot of hard work getting things sorted out. And in fall of 2022, so fall of last year, we kicked off the project. So each community created their own task force. And then we had a group regional kickoff last fall to sort of start the planning process. And today, that planning process is underway. We are, you know, moving into starting to develop strategies for each community's climate action plan, and we are planning to continue this planning process into fall or early winter of this year. So should be wrapping up by the end of this calendar year. Next slide. So I just wanted to touch really briefly on the funding. I think folks sometimes are interested in how that comes together. Basically, the impetus of the funding was the Community Action Grant. We got a $100,000 Community Action Grant during the first round in spring of 2022. That was the limit. Now the limit is $125,000, which is great. We also were able to build off of a grant that the town of Kittery had. They have a grant with the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard called the Joint Land Use Grant, or JLUS grant. And they were able to contribute that, especially towards creating the regional, the toolkit and the regionally relevant template materials. We were able to carve out $10,000 of our regional planning funds that we get in general as a regional planning organization. And then at the end of the day, we still had a bit of a gap between what we believed the project would cost and what we could get from grant fundings. And so together the municipalities are contributing $76,000. So, and that's for all four, not 76 each, but 76 in total. So in the end, each community is getting a climate action plan with robust public engagement for a very small fraction of the cost that it would have cost them if they had gone out and done it on their own. Next slide. So I'll just end with some key takeaways, kind of like Joanna did, which are just these 3 points. First, working together is really hard. It has been so much work administering and coordinating amongst the 4 towns. Each town has, you know, their own needs and intricacies, and so folks like regional planning organizations are very well positioned to coordinate and navigate developing a project that is this complex. And so I definitely recommend to get help, whether that person is leading your project or just advising you on it. I definitely think that that has been a big benefit to making this a success for our communities. I would definitely recommend that if you're doing a regional project or a multi-municipal project, think about how it could have a greater impact even beyond the communities that are involved in the project. Just like we're putting together our toolkit for more municipalities and hoping that this project will be a springboard for other communities in the region to start doing climate action planning. If you're already putting together the project, what more could you do to make it better for all communities across Maine? And then the last point is to implement FAR. So this is a acronym that I learned from ICLEI, one of our sustainability consultants, and it means flexibility, adaptability, and reflexivity. Basically, it just means that like the project you envision at the beginning is not going to be the project you end up with at the end. And that is especially true with working with multiple communities who each have different needs and different speeds at which they can do things. So being flexible, being adaptable, and always reflecting on how the process is going and how it could be improved are very key things to do to make sure that your project is successful, especially when it has a very long timeline with high stakes. So that's it. Thank you all so much. If there's any questions, happy to answer them later in the presentation. I definitely recommend you check out our project website that has a lot more information about this process. And also, we are always available here at SMPDC, and you can feel free to email me and reach out with questions. So thank you.
I'm muted. Thanks, Karina. That was great. Again, keep your questions coming in the chat, and there have been some resources shared there. And also we'll be sharing out all the resources shared in the chat, as well as the slides and the recording, if you do miss anything or have to hop up. So next up, we've got Robin Stanicki with KV-COG. You want to come on and start sharing your screen for us? Hey there.
All right, do I have screen sharing capability?
You should
go
be a
ahead
co-host,
and
yes.
Figure all that out. Share screen. Okay. I've got that here. Everyone can see my screen here. So I think it's really great that the two presentations that we have heard today are those that have certainly a measure of success after a great, description of what the challenges are, and I think it's really wonderful to see how these come about, because if you're here in this webinar because you're just in the beginning of the process, or you're just thinking about what opportunities the CRP is, presenting for your town, or that they, are potential solutions for a problem that your town has, you're probably also thinking about some insurmountable challenges in working with, either neighboring towns, or, simply going through a project that has multiple phases. So what I wanted to share with you today is kind of a messy side of a project. And I chose this because, I actually had two case studies that I could have talked about today. But this one was a little bit messier, and that's for a number of reasons. But these are towns that have really different ways of engaging the community, different town governance and structure and committees, and even down to some differences in the comprehensive plan's ability to articulate what their values are that are similar to each other. So the towns of both Freedom and Unity are members of KV-COG. So that's really interesting that, that lends some strength to working with these two towns. Now, Freedom came to me sometime in the summer last year and said, we would like to talk to KV-COG about an environmental assay of a municipally owned property that we have, and that we are trying to address different environmental problems that it has, but we would also like to develop this property with a respect for the different environmental considerations. So wetland areas and some prior development and that sort of thing. So they weren't even aware of any funding opportunities or any structure such as the CRP, which offers, a mechanism for a wider, basically an assessment of those types of vulnerabilities. So it was the Community Development Action Committee of Freedom that came to us and said, we'd like to do an environmental assay. And I said, oh, but wait, this is fresh out of the oven, and I'd really like to talk to you about this. And I said, why don't you look at some of this opportunity that the that the partnership can unfold into, some of your thoughts on this particular area. Now, you may wonder why it's called the cannery lot in quotes. Now, I thought it was a really interesting story is that it was actually the site of, a cannery. Okay, so this was an industrial site that was a part of Freedom for many, many years, but has been abandoned and unused for about 60 years. So it has a slab, it has about 15 acres of really just a lot of different types of land. So you can see some of this area that also has some snowmobile trails, see some of this like wetland area. And it actually, if you can kind of look a little bit more at my map here, it extends from the town of Freedom, boop, into the town of Unity, crosses over here into the town, into Eastern Thorndike, and then right back down through Knox. So this is an interesting thing that it's crossing through 4 individual towns. So, it begs the question, if you're looking at a multi-town project, how are all these towns essentially friendly with each other? Well, I think it's interesting if you're a service provider and you're really looking to have that feather in your cap, you're really looking to submit a multi-town funding application. Where are those current collaborations already? Where are some of those interlocal agreements, and what are they prioritizing? For example, Knox and Freedom share fire response services, and Freedom and Unity already share some other types of resources. So it's really kind of an interesting thing to see where sort of what is already fitting together nicely in terms of collaborative projects. So again, they're looking at this particular lot. They wanted to see if they could do an environmental assay to get some projects going. And so this is really what they came to me with. They wanted to develop this unused piece of land. It is municipally owned. They wanted to add value to the town because the entrance to this lot was right in the main thoroughfare, Main Street, Freedom USA. Okay, and they really wanted to recognize that this piece of land extended over the boundaries into some of their neighboring communities. So, specifically they recommended, or they recognized the value to the town in terms of economic opportunity. Why? Because they had already developed a sort of a shell of an agreement with a company that was located in Unity. This company is called Daybreak Growers. They are, a food production, agricultural company, and they wanted to extend their productions into Freedom and to use part of this lot to build, a facility. And so they were pursuing other types of grant funds through a number of opportunities. Freedom had also, really been looking into how they could partner with different educational programs. The area is now beginning to sort of bounce back a little bit with some of the charter schools and some of the programming that, could really use, long stretches of undeveloped land. And then they also, we're just sort of imagining how can this push forward any of our desire to have a solar array, for example. So there was a lot of different ways that they really wanted to see this lot used, and they were not opposed to sort of splitting up the use of the land into 3 or 4 chunks, to use something. there was also the idea that they could use part of this land to expand their public works infrastructure to create a sort of a cover, a carport for some of their public works vehicles. So lots of ways they really thought that they could use the land. And so they were really excited to jump on board and to see what the CRP process was. So again, these were some of the ideas, as I just was talking about. And they did have, as I suggested to them, they did have this idea that, where the plot of land went right into Unity or Knox, where could they, sort of expand those efforts as sort of a courtesy, a nod to the fact that these boundaries were crossed. And, if you're going to be doing a project on land that is within your borders, there is already going to be some component of cooperation. So, hey, we want to do an environmental assay, KVCOG. And I said, oh, but wait, we can do some GIS, we can do, some wetlands analysis and that type of thing. But why don't we go, and take a few steps back and see what we can do over here? So I gave them a primer about the CRP enrollment process. And again, as I mentioned, this is the Community Development Action Committee in Freedom. And when I say that they are action, I mean, they were action. Before I realized it, they had like pretty much everything done except for the community engagement process. And they really wanted to kind of dive back into some of the community engagement that they had done, when they started thinking about this lot. So there was a lot of energy here that just sort of overwhelmed me a little bit. And I said, wow, you've really got this together. You understand where the value of the partnership enrollment process really is, to deep dive into the community and get those ideas and get that support. So they completed their process rather quickly. Now, some of the other challenges were approaching their neighboring towns. Surprising to me, they were able to run over to the town of Knox, get a letter of support. I do not know how they did that. There is some interesting relationships. Sometimes, having those towns neighboring in communities where they all have to compete with resources. I mean, this is a real thing for rural towns, and something that I really keep in mind as I'm working with them is that there's always going to be an approach to working with your neighbor that really takes that into account, that there's there's generally an attitude that resources are scarce and they're competitive. And, every town doesn't always have the way to kind of share and have cooperative relationships in all ways. So, bringing out the ways that they do have and share resources, or, things like emergency response and so on and so forth. So it was really surprising and impressive that the chair of that committee was able to go and get that done within a couple of weeks, had a letter of support, and had, basically done my job for me to explain the process to their neighbor. But that's really great, because, though that's something that I would do for a town, it's so great that that town was able to take that lead and take that step and go through it with their neighbor. Now, their other neighbor was the town of Unity. Now, the town of Unity was already part of our slate as a service provider that we were working with to get them enrolled. To even consider putting in a grant application, they both had to be enrolled. So this was an incredible challenge. And this is where the sort of messiness came in, because I mean, you're hearing me say all these really great things, and some they were really quick and they were really on top of it and they really know what they wanted to have, and they ran over to Knox, and it's really great. But then here's where some slogging really happened. The town of Unity really struggled to start their enrollment process. So they, in many ways, really had a big impact on some of these conversations. And so the committee that was that equated freedoms was the Economic Development Committee. Now in Unity, most of that kind of action, other than the Planning Committee, will come out of the Economic Development Committee. So you almost could rename it to the Economic and Community Development Committee, because this committee also was responsible for the formation and funding and starting the Unity Public Library, for example. So, where community development is also closely tied to economic development, they really took on pretty much everything. And so I think what makes this really challenging for Unity, and that it really isn't, due to any sort of like lack of drive on their own, is that they're really carrying quite a burden. And that burden is that they are struggling with reimagining their own community identity and their resources. Their largest community driver basically made a hasty exit in 2020. So every venture, every business, every organization that relied on a Unity College really had to either pivot or they were extinguished. So here we are trying to figure out where to go next. And so it almost seemed like sort of fluff to think about the community resilience project as Freedom had approached them, to say, no, we've got some bigger issues. Like we can't possibly lend effort to this right now. So I think that they really had a hard time sort of scrabbling, even though, they understood the merit and they were excited about it. There just wasn't any traction, especially from the way that your municipally recognized committees can influence the select board. So, there's definitely a priorities discussion in that way. So, it took a few cycles. It took meeting after meeting to really kind of figure out, well, where are we in looking at the partnership as, a worthwhile and profitable activity. So we were able to sort of figure out that the same aim that Freedom had expressed is one that we in Unity also embrace. So we need to increase economic opportunities. We value educational programs because the people are still here, right? All the retired, all of the faculty, former faculty, all of these different resources, and folks that value the sustainability and resilience component of the school, they all still remain. So here's something that we agree on. So that is actually what moved some of our talks forward. And interestingly, it was about 9 months of doing some of that. So looking at the community support was such a challenge because it took a long time for us to even move into getting to that community support. So this was a little bit, the mess. And I said, oh, hey, Freedom, why don't you come over to Unity and maybe you could, lean on each other. Oh, that was a little bit of a learning lesson for me, because there was no way that Unity would want to work with Freedom in any sort of, crutch capability. So I realized that that was a little bit more difficult. So I needed to, avail myself in a more supportive way as being their service provider, and continue to work toward the community meeting. And it was apparent to me after about 9 months that I needed to go to the committee and say, you know what, we are scheduling this community meeting. You don't have the checklist done, you don't have any of these pieces done, that's okay. We're going to do this community meeting, and that can be your context, because at that point, they were trying to generate their context with all of these pieces missing, this identity and this, just this understanding of their economic driver, all of these things. Well, a committee just couldn't do it. So I said, let's just punt it back to the community. We're going to do our community meeting, and then you're going to move forward. And astonishingly, that is all it took. We just turned it around on its head, and we realized you're not getting this done in a smaller way. Let's bring it out. So that's where we went. So we found some points of agreement in both of their comprehensive plans. And that's what, moved this forward a little bit more. So I underlined some lines here: cooperating, collaborating, and coordinating with their neighboring towns was a priority for both of these towns. So again, moving these talks forward. Now, what we have looking forward to is sharing that grant writing effort, and then moving into talks about managing the grant funds and monitoring that project process. So we have some challenges ahead of us, and some of these lessons learned about working with these two small towns, one of them being, very motivated and willing to work, and then the other one really trying to work through some of, their own efforts, as well as joining in the process. But
Hey,
the plus side
Robin,
is
we're running a little late here.
those communities, so we're ready to just lean into the work and help them out. Oh, Yvette, was I over?
Yeah, sorry. I
That's
apologize.
Okay. That's okay.
for
I
cutting you
understand
off.
all of our presentations were really great.
Yeah, thank you again, Robin, Karina, and Johanna for your presentations. I wanted to get to a few of the questions before we sign off. Again, we will send all of these answers out to you all, but there were some great ones in there. Let's see, the first one I wanted to mention was, when will the next grant application deadlines take place? I know Joan Walton with the state has mentioned the timing of those with her program. And what the regional coordinators have been told is that they're waiting for the budget to be passed. And there's going to be a delay. So we're not going to see the same schedule as the March and September as we had. And I would say worst case scenario is going to be it coming out in as late as June. However, if you don't already communicate with a regional coordinator, I'm going to put regional coordinator hyperlink in the chat. These folks send out email newsletters every 2 weeks that keeps everyone abreast of all the grant opportunities. So this is a great way to reach out to one of your coordinators to get on their email list. Let's see, we had another question. Okay, let's see. Do the regional coordinators proactively approach select boards, town managers to enlist? Yes, we can. You can reach out to the regional coordinators in that link. There are also service providers. So today, SMPDC, A Climate to Thrive, KVCOG, and so many others are listed on the website. I'm trying to also put that in the chat. you can reach out to them as well. And I, definitely have gone out and spoken with towns trying to get folks, enrolled. There was one other thing, sorry, I think I only put the coordinators to not everyone. There you go. There was also a question regarding the order of the process. And so that question, let me just read it out loud. All the information I find shows the town's passing resolution, then doing the assessment, then the community discussion, and then enrollment. But the language in the model resolution, which GoPIF provides you, indicates that those steps would have already happened before the resolution. And I know a few people on this call today can also answer this, but I'm going to put in the chat and it'll also come out in the minutes, but I actually live in Topsom, which is not part of my Region 3, and I didn't use a service provider, but I engage with my town, which I think there are questions about if people do believe in climate change or they want to support this stuff. So for me, I wanted to ensure that I had the political will of the select board before I went through the process, because there would have been no point in all the effort. So I got approval to use the language I just put in the chat, which basically offers a timeline as to when you will have those community engagement meetings. And during those community engagement meetings is when you actually can document what you're going to work on. So there is the possibility of changing up those steps. Let me see. So that's what I have to say about that. But certainly, your regional coordinator or service providers could help guide you in that. Let's see, the other one was, are there some standard results metrics being used across projects so the overall impacts, cumulative benefits can be explained, quantified, and defended down the road where funds are less abundant? And Karina, this question actually came up during your presentation, so I was wondering if you wanted to take a crack at results.
Sorry, can you point out where it is?
I think it's very high up in there.
I see. Are some standard results metrics? I think that's more for like the community action grant program as a whole versus just climate action planning. So I think like, are there standard metrics being used to understand the benefits of community action grants? As my understanding is, I don't think there's anything in the reporting requirements that says, greenhouse gas emissions reduced, or, like types of adaptation metrics that exist. But I do think that would be helpful. I don't know if anyone else has any input onto that.
Or if David, you wanted to like add more to, it seems like you continue to chime in on this. If you wanted to unmute yourself. He's just saying, I'm concerned there seems to be little attention on performance metrics.
Currently, the only one really is how many communities are enrolled and how many communities receive grants. Like high vulnerability communities are participating, those sorts of metrics, more about participation.
Right. And then this is a really good one for a lot of us on the call. And Johanna, if you're still on, how do we motivate towns where the predominant viewpoint is that climate change is neither a threat nor worth attention or resources? So we as a town need to do nothing about climate. I know I've kind of talked about social, and economic vulnerabilities. Maybe the word climate change doesn't need to be brought up just once in the resolution, but sometimes I'd rather lead with understanding what the word resilience is. No one has
Actually,
anything
one
else
of
to
the
add.
things, can I just quickly say, I've seen this a lot, and it's curious to me, and I think I spend a lot of time trying to circumnavigate different attitudes. And so I have had select board meetings where they'll say, I don't believe in climate change, but I would pass this resolution if we're talking about energy efficiency, or we're talking about energy savings, or we're talking about, you know, something in the realm of financial advantages. The best way that I'm able to talk to towns about climate impacts is weather right now. I mean, but pretty much every season of the year, you're really able to talk about the impacts of weather on open lands, on roadways. We sell, like, there are so many different aspects of that. So the impact on exactly, Joan, on our infrastructure, you know, because that then relates to a dollar sign that they can relate to as a select person. So I take the temperature a little bit, and then I, you know, whether I lead in with one or the other, sometimes even the R word, resilience, isn't the one that they'll grow into. So.
I just wanted to throw in one other thought there. I think that's spot on. And I would recommend, we ran through a scenario similar to this here locally, and starting by looking at the list of actions and considering those actions through the framework of your town, the lens that is being like currently used in the town, the language currently used in your town, and seeing where there's an overlap. And it might not be like the top action that the person bringing this to the town might feel is the place to start, but like starting where the town already is on that list of actions. And maybe there's different language that's being used to describe the same type of action, looking at the comprehensive plan, and then thinking about how ownership and control over planning and implementation and solutions brings economic benefits to the town, are all, I think, great ways to get started with those discussions.
I would quickly add, it's budget season, so there's your language.
Yeah, good point. And thanks for throwing the 72 actions in the list. And yes, if they're already undertaking something that's on the list, then that makes sense. I think I'll wrap it up here. We don't have any more questions in the chat, so unless somebody wants to unmute or raise their hand. Really appreciate you all sticking it out with us, and look forward to seeing you all on the next one, which is on Valentine's Day with Efficiency Maine. All right, thanks.
Great, thank you.